Today we're reviewing the RTX 2060 with additional tests on if an RTX 2060 has enough performance to really run games with ray tracing, basically Battlefield at this point, and that's on the TU-106 GPU. We have a separate teardown going live showing the even more insane cooler assembly of the RTX 2060 over the 2080 series, besting the previous complexity of the already insane 2080 series. Today's focus, however, will be on performance in gaming, thermals, RTX performance, power consumption, and acoustics for the Founders Edition NVIDIA RTX 2060. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake's Core P3 case. The Core P3 is one of the most unique cases on the market. It can serve as an open-air standing chassis, a test bench in vertical or horizontal orientation, or as a wall-mounted showcase PC. The Core P3 now comes with a 5mm thick tempered glass panel for its side, but keeps the front, top, and back open for air. The Core P3's versatility as a display piece, test bench, or standard desktop is reinforced by its price of roughly $110 on Amazon. You can learn more at the link in the description below. We're going to get right into this one today because CES is now when the video goes live, and so everything's a mess, including having still our new copper mule mugs with thermal conductivity for copper on them on the table. So the 2060 is $350. That's the first thing you need to know. There's no more special Founders Edition price. It's just $350 flat, and that is for the Founders Edition and for partner model baseline MSRP. Partners can go over that. You'll see a lot of cards for $400, but $350 prices will actually exist for some of the cards, just like the 2070s had those low-end models, like the EVGA Black for $500. So that's what you need to know. There's still the A designation for the special GPU bins, the higher frequency ones, which we showed previously. That still exists with the 2060 as far as we know. The 2060 FE is an A SKU. It has been a bit higher than some of the ultra cheap cards, which we might see later. So other prices for cards, just to give everyone perspective, the 1060 these days is about $210 US for a 6GB model, if you can find it. Some of the cards are more like $240, $250, depending on where you look, which was baseline MSRP, but we do see them more regularly than not for $210 or so these days. The RX 590 is about $250 to $270, some at $280, but on average you'll see them $260 or $270 for a 590, which does generally outperform a 1060, but not always. GTA is an example of when it doesn't, but most of the time it does. The RTX 2070, $500 baseline, $550 on average, and then the 2060 falls in between. Now, for performance, we're going to do the content in this order. So there's games for DirectX 12 and DirectX 11 first. Then we'll talk RTX and Battlefield 5. We'll talk thermals extensively. We'll talk noise, and we'll talk power consumption and overclocking, and then we'll give you the wrap-up at the end. Sniper Elite 4 is our first test. This one was chosen because of its well-implemented low-level API access and bypass to the normal abstraction layers presented by both wrappers and DX11. We'll start with our 4K test for a baseline with the most data to compare against. At 4K, Sniper Elite 4 has the stock RTX 2060 at 56 FPS average, with lows well-timed at 50 FPS and 49 FPS, 1% and 0.1% low respectively. This is indicative of consistent frame time performance, something we'll look at next. Overclocking the RTX 2060 to a 160 MHz offset, because 175 was unstable in this game, landed it at 61 FPS average, a gain of approximately 8.9%. Not bad. The EVGA RTX 2070 low-end model, for perspective, performs at 64 FPS average, which is only 4% ahead of the overclocked RTX 2060. Granted, overclocking the 2070 furthers its lead to 70 FPS average, but the point is that the 2060 is nearly achieving 2070 levels of performance when the former is overclocked. The RX 590 ends up at about 43 FPS average when stock, allowing the 2060 a lead of about 31% over the 590. It also has a price difference, but we'll talk about that in the conclusion. The positioning of the 2060 puts Vega 64 just barely ahead of it and functionally tied with the 2060 overclocked. The 1070 Ti also equates 2060 levels of performance, with Vega 56 not distant when stock. Generationally, the RTX 2060 outperforms the GTX 1060 6GB Gaming X and is 37 FPS average by 52%. That's a massive lead. And some of that is because of the 2060's improved capabilities with asynchronous command queuing. Sniper Elite 4 also benefits from the boosted memory bandwidth on the 2060, although the 50% increase in lanes on the vectors further helps. Over the GTX 960 SSC, 4K performance has improved measurably from 20 FPS average to 56 FPS average. higher resolution throughput has seen heavy focus over the past 2 generations. We'll look at frame time performance next. As a reminder, frame time charts are the most representative look at real experience, displaying a frame-to-frame interval for every instant of gameplay. This helps us look at data that would get averaged out in bar charts and best illustrates performance for each individual frame present. Lower is better, but more consistent is more important than lower. Starting with a plot of the GTX 1060 6GB Gaming X from last generation, we see a line plot that sits between 25 and 32 milliseconds, with overall frame-to-frame pacing deviating no greater than 1 to 2 milliseconds per frame. The frame rate isn't that good, as we saw in the previous chart, but the frame time consistency is about as good as it gets. Lowering resolution resolves the frame rate issue, but frame time consistency is the more difficult aspect to get correct, and this one already got it correct. The RX 590 plots next, showing improved frame rate by way of a 20 to 27 millisecond frame time average, also nearing peak consistency. The GTX 1070 plots better frame rate than both of these, nearing 20 milliseconds average, and is the best performer up until we plot the RTX 2060. The 2060 sits between 15 and 20 milliseconds on average, with 16.667 milliseconds representing a 60 FPS throughput if you had 16.667 across the entire distribution. The 2060, like the previous cards, has overall excellent frame time consistency and would present minimal hitching or stuttering in this title. 1080p should be more interesting from a generational scaling standpoint. The RTX 2060 ends up at 151 FPS average stock, which scales 46% over the GTX 1060 6GB stock card, or 165% over the GTX 960 SSC. The 1060 scaled 82% over the GTX 960 SSC for perspective, and the difference is that the price has moved with the RTX 2060, whereas the pricing of the 960 and the 1060 were pretty similar at launch. The 960's launch price was about $200 to $240 depending on partner models, with the 1060 at about $240 to $250 and the 2060 at $350. F1 2018 gives us a look at a well-built DX11 title. At 4K, F1 2018 places the RTX 2060 FE at 54 FPS average, just ahead of the Vega 56 Red Dragon and the GTX 980 Ti hybrid from 2 generations ago. The overclocked RTX 2060 with a plus 175 core offset ends up about tied with the stock RTX 2070, but note that this core offset is difficult to sustain without a lot of testing and good cooling. The 2070, of course, outpaces the 2060 when overclocked, maintaining a lead at 68 FPS average and of 14% when both are overclocked versus overclocked. Versus the stock GTX 1060 from the last generation, the 2060 stock card maintains a 59% improvement. The GTX 960 isn't on this chart due to limited ability to run 4K, and the RX 590 ends up at 38 FPS average, nearer the GTX 1070 than the 2060. At 1440p, the RTX 2060 ends up at 93 FPS average stock, posting excellent 1440p performance and relatively playable 4K performance, which is important to note, but between the two, 1440p of course looks better. This is similar to the GTX 1070 Ti, the two being imperceptibly different, and just behind Vega 64. Versus the GTX 1060, the 2060 posts a gain of 62%, which is more than what we saw at 4K. The 2060 leads the 960 SSC by 173%. Finally, an overclock on the 2060 gets it to nearing error margins of the RTX 2070 stock card's 102 FPS average. Running 1080p instead, we need to pay attention to the scaling gaps between the XX60 generation GPUs. The RTX 2060 places at 120 FPS average, which leads the GTX 1060 Gaming X by 61%, within margin of error of our last distance measured. The 2060 leads the 960 by 167%, down marginally from the lead at a higher resolution. For reference, Vega 56 runs 115 FPS average, which is imperceptibly different from the 1070 Ti and nearing 2060 performance. The RX 590 is far behind at 82 FPS average. Far Cry 5 uses the Ubisoft Dunia engine and is our next benchmark, stressing the geometry pipeline and putting load on the cards by way of screen space reflections and geometric complexity with longer draw distances. Running 4K, the RTX 2060 ends up at 41 FPS average. Dropping settings would allow this to be a bit more playable, of course, and increase frame rate, but it may make more sense to instead go down to 1440p. Either way, scaling positions, this is, again, functionally equivalent to the 1070 Ti. It's within margin of error, and Vega 56. The 2070 is ahead by a bit, but both cards are having trouble with this workload at 4K. 1440p shows the same positioning. The 2060 places within error of the 1070 Ti. It's led by Vega 64, but is now led more significantly by the 2070, which holds a lead of 12%. Overclocking the 2060 pushes it to 82 FPS average, or roughly tied with the stock 2070. Vega 56 is outside of perceptible differences versus the 2060, with the RX 590 trailing notably behind at 55 FPS average. For perspective, the GTX 960 is at the bottom of the chart. At 1080p, the 2060 ends up over 100 FPS average when in stock, falling between the 1070 Ti and Vega 64 cards, not distant from the GTX 1080 FTW. Generational improvement versus the stock 1060's 73 FPS average posts a 47% lead, not as big as we've seen elsewhere, but still a tremendous leap. The GTX 960 SSC operated 44 FPS average in the same test, demonstrating how far we've come by allowing the 2060 to pull a 144% lead. Again, that's not quite as large a lead as in other tests, and helps illustrate that the 2060's biggest improvements over Maxwell would be in higher resolution performance. Shadow of the Tomb Raider uses a modified Crystal engine and should eventually get some RTX implementation, but for today, we're testing just with high settings and TAA across all three resolutions, 1080, 1440, and 4K. We disabled AA in some SLI testing, but those aren't relevant for this comparison. The RTX 2060 ends up at 37 FPS average in 4K testing between Vega 56 and the GTX 1080. Overclocking the 2060 pushes it to 40 FPS average, so it's still struggling. We'll need more than just a settings drop to get reasonable frame rate out of this game, as evidenced by the 2070's baseline performance of 41 FPS average, right near the overclocked 2060. Let's drop to 1440p. At 1440p, the RTX 2060 runs a 68 FPS average, now playable, and maintains 1% and 0.1% low performance, also nearing 60. This kind of frame time consistency tightness is indicative of an overall smooth frame rate with no stutters interval to interval. The 2060 leads the 1060 6GB 41 FPS average by 65%, further leading the 960 SSC by 179%, consistent with previous games. The RX 590 runs closer to the GTX 1070, with the RTX 2070 stock card being tied by the overclocked RTX 2060. This makes a compelling argument for buying a cheaper 2060 and overclocking it in order to achieve 2070 performance, at least in rasterization. Just for reference in this chart, we also included the XC Ultra 2070 data. We'd been culling it for chart length reasons in the previous ones, but it clearly illustrates that higher-end 2070s will outperform the cheaper model. And we technically have a bit more data here. We have GTA data, we have some more 1080p data, but we'll leave that to the article and link it below if you want that, and instead move on to something different, which is Battlefield 5 RTX testing. This will teach us something new, whereas GTA is mostly a repeat of the previous benchmarks in terms of scaling. With Battlefield 5, the RTX 2060 tested in single player with DXR off on low and on ultra is what you're looking at now. Note that this is after the recent performance improving patch, so BF5 is at peak performance here. With DXR fully disabled, we measured a 104 FPS average using ultra settings across multiple test passes, with frame buffering disabled and all post-processing in the basic tab disabled as well, like chromatic aberration or lens distortion. Frame time is posted 61 FPS 1% and 56 FPS 0.1%, which is actually not the best, and we looked at frame time data and it oscillates a bit between 8 milliseconds and 12 milliseconds. Now that gap isn't big enough to really see or observe as a human, but it's getting there. It's about 8 to 12 milliseconds is the perceptible range for most humans looking at frame-to-frame intervals. Anyway, we'll look into that more later, perhaps after CES. But it wasn't the most consistent run we've seen yet, and that's why those lows are not as high as the average. DXR on low puts us at 66 FPS average, with DXR on ultra drooping to 55 FPS, allowing 0.1% to hit 33 FPS average. So we'll give the 2060 credit where it's due. It's able to play this game at 1080p and roughly 60 FPS with ray tracing fully enabled, or well, partially enabled anyway. It does lose about 40% of its performance in doing so, but it can do it. So it'd be a question of, do you want to play at 1440p Ultra with no ray tracing, or 1080p Ultra, no ray tracing at 100 plus FPS, or do you want to tank your FPS, go down to 1080p and take the ray tracing? And it's sort of subjective, but as people who have seen all of these options in person, we can tell you that generally speaking, killing the ray tracing on this card and instead going for the higher frame rate in this particular game does feel a bit better. But it's going to depend on the game, like if it's a more in-depth RPG or something where you want that immersion. So we'll talk about that if it ever happens. Let's get into thermals. For this, we disassembled the RTX 2060 and attached thermocouples to the PCB components. We have some B-roll of the disassembly process that we can show. It's an insane amount of effort to take this card apart. NVIDIA's use of hot glue to hold in fan cables and 7 screws to hold in that same fan cable really don't make sense. It's crazy what they did to assemble this thing, but the rest of the heatsink fan assembly is equally crazy, and you can watch our teardown video coming up shortly for that if you haven't already seen it. The PCB is the same as an RTX 2070 PCB, it's just the cooler has been actually changed a decent amount. The PCB has been simplified though, they've removed memory modules of course, but we already know the hotspot MOSFETs from the 2070 PCB, so we put thermocouples on those. Starting first with Furmark for torture thermals, we measured the stock GPU temperature as 68 degrees Celsius throughout the test. Ambient was 22 degrees plus or minus 1. For our regulars, this isn't presented this time as delta T over ambient, it's just 68 degrees straight. Setting the fan noise to 40 dBA to normalized noise levels with our other tests, we see GPU temperature fall to 64 degrees because NVIDIA's default fan profile leans it more toward quiet than cool. And so 40 dBA, a reasonable noise level, actually brings a reduction in thermals, which isn't all that common. MOSFET temperatures end up at 78 degrees Celsius for the stock card, which is within spec and reasonable, or 73 degrees for the 40 dBA variant on testing. These MOSFET thermals are within spec and doing fine overall. There's really no problem here, not until you're 90 plus degrees, and even then it's not really catastrophic. We won't bother plotting this, but for the curious, the auto fan speed was 1700 RPM or about 45%, 40 dBA fan speeds are about 52%. For the next chart, we're looking at 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme performance over a prolonged period. The point is to see how the core clock behaves when under a gaming workload, as some clocks will bounce around more heavily based on load. First, plotting the temperature, we see GPU core temperature at 69 to 70 degrees on the left axis, with MOSFET temperature at 76 degrees also on the left axis. The frequency line comes in next, starting initially at 1935 megahertz. And remember, this is stock, so that's a pretty high frequency, and dropping almost immediately to 1875 megahertz once at steady state. Frequency sustains at this level in a nearly perfect line, which is rare and good. The drop from 1935 megahertz is because GPU core temperature steadily rises from 30 degrees up to where it lands, driving down frequency pursuant to boost behavior. Every couple of degrees matters for frequency. Overall though, NVIDIA is doing better on this card than its previous designs, and that's because the TDP is lower overall for the GPU core than the 2080 series. Now, TDP is not lower, in fact it's higher versus the 10 series, but that's not really what we're looking at here. We'll look at that in a moment. As for noise levels, we're starting at a lower baseline of 32% or 1190 RPM with RTX 2060, whereas some of the previous RTX cards had a floor of 41% or 1525 RPM. The RTX 2060 has the same acoustic performance as the other RTX coolers, more or less, but does plot idle noise lower at 31.4 dBA. The average load fan speed is about 1670 RPM in 22 degree ambient testing environments, putting fan speeds at around 37 dBA. You can expect it to be a bit higher, maybe 39 to 40 in a hot case. 100% loads put the RTX 2060 at 58.7 dBA. It's still louder than a good aftermarket cooler, but it's similar to low-end coolers like the RTX 2070 Black by EVGA. So this is just going to depend on how much money you spend on the card. Remember that decibels are logarithmic, so these increases are non-linear. It's not the same scale as you see with other charts. People tend to start noticing noise changes for reference with roughly every 3 dBA increase or thereabouts. It's a bit of a human perceptual difference there. So that's kind of up to you. Finally, for power consumption, we're looking at total system power draw with a heavily controlled test bench. All voltages are controlled on the motherboard, ensuring no fluctuations that would throw off measurements. This is not individual card draw, but an overtime plot of total system draw. First, the RTX 2060 ends up at about 260 watts to 300 watts total system power consumption, occasionally spiking to 310 watts. The average sustained high is about 300 watts flat. Overclocking the GPU pushes the system to 360 peak, but the average sustained high for the overclocked variant is closer to 320 watts with that OC we applied. The GTX 1060 Gaming X with an overclock pushes about 240 watts total system power draw. For perspective, so NVIDIA has gone up generationally alongside its performance increase. It makes the performance gains a little bit less impressive when you put into perspective the required additional power to do it. Now, it's not a lot of additional power compared to some other cards we've seen in the market, but it is an increase, and that takes away some of the just how special it was to see those 50+% gains, because it's not really that directly comparable when you have higher power consumption. TDP was previously 120 watts and is now 160 watts by NVIDIA spec, and power consumption difference is noticeable here. This is still below the RX 590's total system power consumption of 320 to 330 watts, but not by much. We won't plot it since it'd make the chart too busy, but note also that the RTX 2070 is roughly the same as the 2060, except it's about 10 to 20 watts higher on average, maybe lining up at about 15 watts over the whole test. So overall, the 2060 is very close to the 2070 in power consumption, which makes sense given the performance. We'll put overclock stepping on the screen briefly. This is the chart of our overclock progression. It's about the same as the previous cards. Overclocking did pretty well on our 2060. This will be your mileage may vary scenarios where, I mean, if the cooler's not as good or if you just got a worse bin, then not much you can do about it. But that's what we got. So it did overclock well. The biggest thing here with overclocking is if you like the 2070 performance, but you don't like the price because you just don't have enough money to justify it, then the 2060 can basically become a 2070. It doesn't scale linearly in every application, but it's pretty darn close. And on average, the 2060 overclocked is about 2070 baseline performance for a $500 2070. And of course, you can overclock a 2070 too. But if you just want 2070 baseline, you can buy a 2060, overclock it, and pretty much get there. You'll be within a couple percent, and it's a great way to save $150 or more dollars. So that's something to keep in mind. The RT performance might not scale quite the same way. We haven't looked into that just yet, but we do have some baseline numbers to give you the rest of it. Now, as for the rest, 2060 is a strong 1440p performer. It, of course, has no problem with 1080p. 4K is difficult to do with those ultra and very high settings, but can be done with medium or lower settings. It's just kind of a question of what do you want. You want the frame rate and the higher quality, or do you want resolution? And on average, I think most people generally would prefer the higher quality to just straight higher resolution, because you'll start noticing the low quality at some point. So 1440p for sure, no problem. 4K, if the game is lightweight enough, yeah, but probably not on average. We wouldn't buy it for 4K as the main goal of the GPU. Versus the RX 590, the RX 590 makes a lot of sense at $240, $250, $260, and especially versus the 1060, although the 1060 does have a few instances where it's better. So if you're only playing GTA 5, just get the 1060. But that game's pretty old now. People do play more than one thing. The 590 on average is better overall. The 590 versus the 2060 doesn't necessarily make sense as a discussion point because it's a $100 price difference. The 590, if you really struggle to justify an extra $100, the 590 is fine. It does 1080, it does 1440 mostly fine. You can tweak the settings, you'll be okay. The 2060, obviously, different category of price. For performance and value, it is significantly improved over the previous NVIDIA RTX launches. NVIDIA is feeling much more confident about this product in speaking with them than in terms of market perception than the previous launches. The 2080, as we all know, just to recap it, really had no value over the 1080 Ti. It was RT cores and no games had RTX when it launched, or for the 52 days following. And beyond that, performance is about 1080 Ti performance. So there was no value there. The 2080 Ti had value because it's the best, but that only gets you so far when it's $1,200 plus. So those were much more rocky. They were difficult launches for NVIDIA. The 2070 started to turn things around a little bit. The 2070 $500 cards were decent enough value where you could definitely justify it or argue it over competition, including primarily competition from NVIDIA's previous generation. But once you got past $500, it was a really difficult argument, actually, especially at $550. The value just was not that great. So the 2060 furthers that and does correct things a bit. At $350, the value is pretty good overall, we would say. If you are looking for something that's strictly enthusiast level for fun overclocking, we would still recommend Vega 56. It's the most tweakable. It's pretty open. You can do power play tables mods that you can't do on NVIDIA for registry entry modifications of power limits. And VBIOS is still pretty locked down, but there are things you can do to get around stuff on AMD, whereas you can't really with NVIDIA. You're pretty locked in. So if you want just enthusiast level fun, genuinely just overclocking for fun, then Vega 56 gets our vote still. if you're going for performance out of the box, or you might overclock for an hour or two and then you never touch it again for 3 years, the 2060 is a good option to consider. It outperforms the cards that are cheaper than it pretty much, well, significantly in most instances. Significant outperformance versus the 1060, a bit more power consumption, about 170% performance uplift, so you're 2x plus, you're 170% more performance than GTX 960 SSC 4GB card. So if you're 900 generation, that's a significant improvement. 700 generation, significant improvement. Versus RX 590, it's also holding a pretty big lead on average. So it's really Vega 5664 you're kind of looking at, and those more or less flank the 2060. So it comes down to price. And if you can get a 2060 for $350, it is a pretty easy argument that that would be a reasonable purchase, or one of the better purchases, overclocking enthusiast options notwithstanding, where we'd still push you towards Vega 56, because it's a lot of fun. You can really unlock it, do a lot with it, but it doesn't mean it's the best performer or the best power consumption, especially when it's overclocked. So lots of stuff for you to consider on the market these days. That's why these conclusions are getting longer, and it's more like, for option A, consider these. For option B, consider these. And it's not just a flat out buy X, buy Y, because it is a complex market. So 2060 for out of the box performance, $350, we're fine with it. It is significantly improved over the previous RTX launches, so good for NVIDIA there. And it can actually, somewhat surprisingly, do RTX. Now, that said, Battlefield 5's ray tracing implementation is pretty gross. It's really not well done. We have a whole video analyzing it. I'm not going to go into it here. You can just search the channel for like Battlefield 5 RTX. And our in-house 3D artist, an expert in all of this stuff, helped me analyze it and did a great job, where we talk about the shortcomings of RTX and the good things that it does. So that's really not a compelling reason to buy the 2060. The performance is, though, and the rasterization performance. I will say the Founders Edition cooler is completely insane. It makes absolutely no sense. They made it worse than the 2080 and 2080 Ti. It's still using glue, but now in more places. It uses glue to hold the cable in place. It uses 7 screws to hold the fan cable in place. They've got soldered connectors, wires for the PCIe connector, which are a risk of being broken if you need to service the fans or replace the paste, which are very common things to do overall. And they changed the screw sizes from the previous ones. They still have just as many screws. Really, if NVIDIA ever gets these back, if you have one, the fan dies, you send it back, they're going to throw it away. There's no way it's worth the service technician's time that they're paying him or her to repair a card that you can barely even open. So it is functionally impossible for a novice to service, and it is difficult for an expert to service. But if you want to buy something for a challenge, I guess buy the 2060 and try to take it apart. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up something like one of our brand new copper mule mugs with the thermal conductivity of copper written on it, because we think we're clever like that. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, helps it directly. Stay tuned for CES. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.